people who are either able to drive radical change through the mess of British politics, or who are able to build alternative systems and processes outside of it, will be successful. They'll be radically quite successful. The system, be that the public or other, establishment politicians or markets, will acknowledge that and realize that, and they'll do something about it. My instinct is the systems break down a bit. Live players are going to start to engage with this and going to find a way to make change happen. And that could be for the good. That could be for the very bad. That depends on your politics and what you think is going to happen. But I think...
Who now has anything to say about the deindustrialization of this country?
Georgian townhouses on the moon, the highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way. Small modular reactors under every village green. This is Anglo-futurism.
Welcome back to the King Charles III Space Station. I'm Tomo.
And I'm Calum Drysdale. This week, we've been trying to do some spring cleaning and spruce up the station a bit to bring it in line with our licence as an extraterrestrial boozer cum gastropub.
The regulations, however, have got the better of us. First, our door was too narrow to allow people in wheelchairs to get in. Then we widened the door, but that let too much hot air escape, which lowered our energy efficiency rating.
That meant that we had to replace our fireplace with a central heating system and replace the windows with a double mullioned glazing to come back up to scratch.
And then we weren't allowed to change the facade, as this particular type of wattle and regolith design is now protected, and the 21st Century Society threatened to take us to court if we made any changes.
Luckily, we have a secret weapon in our back pocket. To help us cut through the morass of regulations, we invited our friend up to the station. Cleaver of Cludge, an enemy of everythingism. He has issues with your single issues and polices +1 more policies. He deregulates better than your ex. Quangos are quaking, dropping Fs in the Teams chat. He's bringing efficiency back. Founder of the Greater London Project and Director of Policy at the Reform think tank, former Treasury boffin, and now uncivil civil service servicer, Joe Hill. Welcome to the KC3.
Welcome, guys. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Great to have you. Great to have you. Now, we are currently soaring over Anglesey, aren't we? You can look at through that double glazing mullion window, in the porthole in the floor. There's Anglesey, and I note there is no nuclear plant.
Yeah, so the planning inspectorate rejected an application for an power plant in Anglesey, powered by nuclear energy a few years ago. And it's kind of recently emerged that one of the reasons they rejected it was that they were worried that new workforce you would need to bring in to run a nuclear power plant on a small island off of Wales would dilute the percentage of Welsh speakers in the area. So it's, one of a set of reasons, but that's ultimately part of how they came to their decision. So, we have less clean, free energy in an area which desperately needs it because it wouldn't help the local language.
I was supposed to ask a follow-up question, but I've just got my head in my hand.
Listeners, Tom, I think, has actually just leapt out of the window and is plummeting back to Earth in despair.
So, and let me guess, there was no alternative power station created elsewhere. There's just like a gap where the nuclear power station should be.
Yeah, no, we haven't got a great track record of building any kind of nuclear power in this country, and unfortunately, this isn't an isolated incident. But I think it's a particularly unusual one, and that's why the kind of Twitter sphere has latched onto it because of this particular reason.
Who made that decision?
So ultimately, I think the decision was a combination of the kind of planning inspectorate's advice and the government. In any of these cases, I think it's hard to point the finger at a single decision maker because even if ultimately it's a government official that makes that decision or a minister. So many people have been involved in this kind of death by 1,000 cuts of process of adding requirement after requirement after requirement that ultimately these projects get so big that they can never really stand up.
Was there not a thought, given how much this costs, of just teaching the workers Welsh?
I'd have to get back to you on that, but I suspect if that's what we've got to get to jump through the loophole, then it's a bad loophole.
How about this? I volunteer myself to go and learn Welsh and live in Anglesey if that's what's necessary to get the project
Do a
off
Welsh
the ground.
GCSE 10 times over to offset it for the nuclear engineers.
Have you not had any Welsh speakers yet on the podcast?
Well, there's a Cymro futurism podcast. We're
Exactly.
sure.
The Powys futurists are actually very angry at us. And
Well, because Dogger Bank has to be made out of something, right? And so we proposed leveling the mountains of Wales to provide all the stone that we need to put in the North Sea.
and thus turning the Welsh valleys into the Welsh flats.
The Welsh step.
The Welsh steppe, exactly. The recurve bows of the of Penrith.
So this is just another of the countries that we've alienated over the course of... I don't think we have many Argentinian listeners after our recent podcast on Antarctica.
No, that is certainly true. But the point is, Joe, that this is not the only time that this sort of death by 1,000 cuts has taken place, right? That a similar sort of process took place at Sizewell C, right? And what was this fish disco?
Yeah, so the details still kind of remain unclear because I think the plan is part of the works, and obviously we're recording this on a day when the Prime Minister has yet again given the go-ahead to Sizewell C. I think a reactor which has been given the go-ahead by many different Prime Ministers over its lifetime. So it's a miracle that it still doesn't quite exist. But the issue, seemed to be that as part of the environmental impact assessment, planners for the reactor were quite worried about the impact that the water kind of intake and exchange system would have on local species of fish, and they wanted to keep them away from that, make sure they don't get sucked in or kind of damage it. And so I'm hazy on the technical details of how this nightclub comes to work, but there is a plan for some kind of fish disco in the water that will use sound waves to kind of repel the fish.
Well, it's like
What kind of music do they
I was going to say it's like that scene in Finding Nemo, where he's in the aquarium and he gets sucked up the tube into the filter, and you remember he wedges the pebble in. Clearly, if that dentist had just been playing a mixture of Wagner and electro funk, none of those fish would have ever got out of the tank. But this is Joe, not the only example where these kind of rules and these kind of regulations over like very small elements and like small concerns, such as the killing of, and I think the numbers were that this sucking up of water to cool the reactor would result in fewer fish deaths than the sort of average take of a small local fishing boat. That like this is an immensely small number of species and fish that have held up what is otherwise a vast industrial, vast infrastructure project. And this is not the only time where this sort of thing has taken place, is it? I mean, this is a bit of a pattern.
Yeah, and it's a pattern which we think has some kind of common components to it, and maybe we'll get on to what those are and how we think of them in a bit. But some of the other examples we've been talking about recently, staying for a minute within the area of kind of planning, house building, and infrastructure, which I think is really rife with this stuff. I think one of the kind of most pernicious things that gets in the way of, at a much more micro level, just new housing development. We're not talking about nuclear clean energy for everyone. We're just talking about homes for normal people. Is the Town and Country Planning Act's requirement for what they call biodiversity net gain. So this is a sort of broad measure that is applied in lots of weird and wonderful ways to new housing developments, that new development should not even just not interfere with the biodiversity in the area, but actively promote it and increase it by 10%. Now, you might ask, 10% of what? And that's where we get into tricky details and, the whole armies of consultants and planners who are willing to charge you as a house builder or a developer a lot of money to figure that out. But it's another of these sort of weird ways of doing our environmental policy where we've decided at the margin, the person who should be responsible is the individual kind of property developer.
Was this part of the Town and Country Planning Act when it was conceived in the 1940s?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. I suspect not. I suspect it was an amendment, but I don't know.
Well-meaning insertion.
Yeah, we should look that up.
It's an example of where an act that we already don't like has actually become worse.
It's acted out.
And then there's another example that I think you talk about, which is the gangs matrix database, right?
Yeah, so the gangs matrix is a kind of long-running database used by the Metropolitan Police to track intelligence leads who they think are involved in some way in gang activity. So, some of these people will have criminal records, some of them won't, but they're in there not because they just have a criminal record, but because officers suspect that they're linked to some kind of gang activity. And, I've never looked at the database myself, but, my understanding is a matrix because they want to be able to understand, the affiliations between different kinds of gang members. And I think, we would all kind of agree that you don't want police services, particularly ones like the Met, which kind of have institutionally this long history of racism, basically, to continue that. But, they've discontinued it after a long-running campaign by a whole set of bodies that says the existence of the database itself is racist because it's unusually high proportion of minority ethnic people in it. Where I think in some sense denying the police the existence of a database to track suspected gang members, is maybe not the right solution to the problem of kind of any perceived and actual racism. That it's kind of a reasonable problem to want to do something about, but a whole big lever to pull to fix that problem, which I'm also not convinced will really make any difference to how the police think about or act on any kind of racial bias that they have.
And that is also the result of an act, is it?
The act that would underpin that would be the Equalities Act. I'm not convinced that that's actually become a kind of legal decision. I think that that's people's interpretation of an act, which is very, very widespread. And perhaps what we're kind of getting into here, and maybe we'll talk about with some of the other examples, is the extent to which, as we've taken different policies and put them into statute, into law, and said this policy has a level of precedence over others, government has removed the ability to make some of these trade-offs from people. We've removed our ability to kind of rationally think, well, that's a problem, but it's maybe not the problem to tackle in this particular way. And so I think legislation like the Equalities Act is sometimes kind of really badly applied, and it's partly badly applied because it takes these huge sweeping generalizations of how it should be applied in the first place.
And this is the subject of this essay that you have written recently, right? The idea that there are laws that have been, with sort of well-meaning laws, brought into being the hope of tackling a problem, but have been applied, like a hammer to crack a nut, have been applied in this very, very broad way, and that are really hampering the ability of the government and even and bodies, sort of operational bodies of the government to act. I mean, tell me about this theory of everythingism.
So everythingism is a theory I've developed of how policymakers in Britain have started to go wrong, and everythingism, the way I use it, means the idea that every policy can be kind of about every other policy, everywhere, all at once, and not just that it can be, but that either there's kind of no trade-off to doing that. That's easy and uncostly. And actually, in a really extreme example, that is a good thing, that making everything about everything else is in some way kind of valuable, high social status, doing the best job you can, those combination of things. And I think everythingism is a really bad thing. And these are all the things we've talked about, quite good examples of everythingism, where, we're talking about policy goals, which are good goals, right? I think broadly, I don't have strong personal feelings about the Welsh language either way, not being Welsh, but
You mean you've never read the Mabinogion?
I'm going to have to take your word for it that that's how it's pronounced.
I just record about 8 different pronunciations of it as a way. Aaron, just cut one of these in, please.
Maybe you can find a Welsh producer and ask them to sort you out on that one. But otherwise we're talking about kind of clean energy, home building, environmental protection, equality, crime. These are all like good problems to want to solve, but using them, trying to solve them through other big policy levers, which are kind of often a bit tangential, can have these massive unintended consequences. We don't really think it through. So everythingism is bad, and it's why we don't have nice things in this country. We don't have policy that works. Everythingism, I think, is why nothing works.
This reminds me of something one hears about procurement, which is that 10% of tender evaluation scores, i.e. the score by which the government decides who to give the contract to, are awarded based on the contractor's wider value to society. So it could be its impact on the environment, sustainability. It could be its adherence to DEI rules of some kind. And I understand that this leads to instances of total woke nonsense, right?
I think social value is like a good example of like us really trying to do a good thing and doing it pretty badly, actually.
This is the cross-party think tank talking.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the problem with social value procurement, and look, I've worked on kind of both sides of government procurements for like everything from Home Office databases to, AI for the MOD. And I've also seen like really small charities trying to win like £100,000 contracts from local government. We throw into the mix in all of these purchasing decisions this kind of broad term social value, and social value is what the last government called it. Labour have rebranded social value, social and economic value. Kind of hard to see what extra work the economic is doing in there, but it really covers all manner of sins, right? It can cover all kinds of different objectives, which anyone who's doing the buying wants to throw into the mix and feels like it's best. It's the wild west of procurement. I mean, it's 10% of contract value, but often these contract decisions come down to 1 or 2%, and how you score on that can make a huge difference, right? And it leads to all kinds of weird behavior. It leads to massive companies spending huge amounts on net zero consultancies to come in and tell them how they can cut their energy bills. Now, for some companies that feels maybe like it's proportional, but you can't tell me for a second that like the difference between any of these companies' ability to really reduce their emissions is going to be like that significant, right? Like should that at the margin be how a big defense contract is awarded? I really doubt it.
It's not just big defense contracts, right? Like I was applying for a UKRI smart grant.
Oh God, I'm sorry.
Well, no.
Not smart enough, Evan.
Otherwise, you wouldn't be on the podcast.
Yeah, exactly. This was for my $1 billion startup, which are still looking for investors. So, but yeah, and we as a team of 2 had to fill out like how our bioreactor retrofitting business would like result in kind of a better social good. And I think, that point you made there about the rebranding of this as not just social good, but social and economic good. That rebranding without potentially tinkering with any of the underlying things cuts this question of, as you mentioned, trade-offs, right? That there is an unwillingness to accept that if we do one good thing, it is not always correlated with the other good things, right? Like, I think there's a good example of, I think it was the Green Party leader recently saying, immigration is always good for the country, which, I think unless you were the most radical believer in immigration, you would say, well, I think there's probably levels to it, right? That it is good having good people come and it's bad having bad people come. But to have like such a categorical view of it maybe speaks to the heart of this like unwillingness to recognize that not all the things we like come together.
Totally. And I think it's always a question of like what's the cost. So, the government spends, to use the procurement example, 400 billion a year buying stuff from other people. And that's everything from, the Home Office buying some tech down to a local council buying its accountants. And that's a big part of the economy. It can reshape that. And that's the point of this, right? Is to try and find a lever to reshape the economy. But everyone else looks at that 400 billion and sees it as an opportunity. I look at it and see it as a huge risk. I look at it and see it as a risk to, reshaping the economy in ways that we don't expect to, because generally markets have been quite good at running the economy, and we're distorting those quite heavily by something which we can't price in a consistent way. We can't evaluate in a consistent way. So I think it can be very dangerous.
I think the trade-offs thing is really interesting. And one of our listeners, who we'll call Laura, put in with a good question. And she said the most important part for me about everythingism is, as you put it, the denial of trade-offs. And Laura brings up how the denial of trade-offs is one of the key reasons why the government is constantly borrowing, constantly getting bigger. And she thinks it's a pathology that goes deeper than public policy, and it's seeped into our culture. So she asks, and we're curious as well, what are the most glaring denials of trade-offs you've ever seen in policy?
Yeah, too many to count. I think one which is really relevant to the current moment is the government's desire to move bits of government out of London and out of the southeast. And there was a phase when I was still a civil servant and we were doing levelling up, and that was big, that this was a big thing. But actually, a lot of this goes much, much further. And you look at the Office for National Statistics, for example, the ONS moved the majority of its workforce outside of London to Newport in Wales over a decade ago. And this was partly a move to kind of create good, high-paying jobs in that local economy. Huge percentages of the workforce said, nope, don't want that, don't want to move to Wales, stuff that. And guess what? It was really, really hard to replace them locally because not a lot of qualified statisticians and economists happen to live in that part of the country. There aren't big universities which are a feeder for it. There isn't a kind of huge graduate workforce that wants to be retrained. And it's hard to draw like a really clear line of sight. But you go forward today, and in the press right now, there's a huge amount of scrutiny over the ONS and its performance. They made loads of very, very basic data categorization mistakes recently. They're, I think, under investigation by the Public Accounts Committee in Parliament. And we are going through probably a pretty big economic contraction right now with Trump's tariffs. We don't know because no one's counting.
Well, this is the insane thing, that the Labour Force survey isn't going to be useful until 2027, right? That this really basic part of government, which is looking at yourself and knowing what like your limbs are doing, and the government is like basically flying blind, right?
Well, we had Tom Jones on the pod a few weeks ago saying that the government doesn't know how many people are in this country and might be off by several million.
Yeah, there are loads of examples. I mean, this is stretching a bit away from the ONS one now, but another great example of where the government just doesn't know basic things is the Home Office's crime data, which is basically the police's crime data, the Ministry of Justice's prisons data, and the joining link for about a third of cases, the Crown Prosecution Service's charging data, doesn't fit together. You can't make those three data sets fit together. You can't follow very easily an individual case through those three stages of the justice process, which makes perfect sense because those are three different bits of government. They've all got their different objectives. They're all making trade-offs in their own way. And we've decided that the day-to-day needs of a police force trump the country being able to look at the sum total of those things and work out, oh God, we keep having to let people out of prisons because we're overflowing on capacity. Maybe we should know how many people are coming down the pipeline. I think that a lot of these very basic things we don't do right because of everythingism.
And Joe, you've written this report on everythingism, which has been very widely circulated in policy circles. How did the idea arise? How did you spot everythingism?
So as a former civil servant, I sort of feel like everythingism's been with me my whole career.
But is it like those fish where they're like, "How's the water?" And
yeah, it is a bit. That's a good. I think my first encounters with everythingism were sort of being indoctrinated into it, right? Now I have this concept, policy memes, and everythingism is sort of one of them, or is maybe the result of them. And policy memes are like things you say in Westminster, and regardless of the context you're saying or what you're talking about, the people at the table kind of nod sagely at you and go, "Oh, Joe said the words. He's our kind of guy." That's a policy meme. Its value is its descriptive symbol, not what's actually going on. And one of the ones you're taught very early on in the civil service is joined up thinking. We need to not be silo based things. We need to be joined up in it. This comes from a set of different policy initiatives which people think failed because they didn't think through the unintended consequences, and they didn't realize that all policies complicate and joined up. So there's a true element to that, but the way it's practiced in Westminster is you don't even really have to think about what you're saying should be more joined up. You just say it, and people think you're the smartest person in the room. So very early on in my civil service career, that was one of these sort of learned behaviors I learned. You see excesses of it at all different stages. And I think over time I got a bit more jaded with it. I got particularly more jaded with it at the Treasury, when you are literally having to weigh up and count the cost of some of these things. And it just felt to me like no one else was. Be it the financial cost, the full economic cost, the cost to society, however you want to think about it.
Because they were joining the money pipe in to the money pipe out.
Yeah, very, very easily. Where the term actually comes, the term isn't mine. The term comes from a discussion a few of us had, and particularly my friend Anton Howes, who came up with the term and has very graciously lent it to me for the course of the essay. But I was sort of trying to work out, like, what's the intellectual basis for this? Like, where is it true? Where is it not? And how are we more rigorous? And, what's the flip side? Like, what's the economic theory that tells us that actually trade-offs are important? Because I think we all, like, personally know, right? You can't have it all. Not all good things go together. But at an institutional level, we've sort of forgotten that. And so I try to work out what this was about. That's kind of what we came up with. And very quickly, the term took off. I think the first few times we used it on social media, loads of people went crazy for it. We'd never published about it. We hadn't written anything about it, but people loved it. So we knew we were onto something.
You've reminded me of a funny story I once heard about the coalition that you might be familiar with, where Michael Gove and Nick Clegg are working together on something, and Clegg complains that they're operating in silos, and then Michael Gove starts kind of running intellectual rings around Clegg by saying, "Well, what's wrong with a silo?" and so on.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I've heard that.
That's where we store grain. Like, they're highly
so
useful.
the thing I say is we fire missiles out of silos, right? Like, they work for that, and we need to be able to do that. Some of the most impressive feats we can do. It's slightly tongue in cheek because I get a lot of people who've been kind of frustrated with the essay or annoyed about the essay, who I think are misreading it, but they will kind of reflexively say, well, this is just a call for more siloed thinking, and we do too much of that. And I think it's the opposite. I think there are lots of cases where we need to understand the complexity of policy more, but I think, like, complexity and trade-offs are good as a description of policy, but they're not good as a prescription for action. They're not good as a roadmap, as an individual trying to work out, how can I fix this system? And siloed thinking or accusation of it have kind of become a, like, if you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It's become the kind of messianic way of trying to bash a policy problem. You go, oh God, we need to be even more joined up on this. And that, in practice, that means dozens of civil servants running around with PowerPoints trying to coordinate everyone and probably not doing a great job of it.
Well, and there's this question, right, that, like, there's this belief that if you're imaginative enough, if you're clever enough, you can shape some twisty, complicated policy that, will be, as a result, 10 times as long, but will
you can
be...
hit 8 hammers with one nail.
Yeah.
sorry. You can hit 8 nails with one hammer.
Yeah, exactly. But it requires a ridiculous looking hammer, right? Like, but if
That'd be a great image for the podcast, actually, guys.
so if you're clever enough, you can achieve this, and there are basically no downsides to it, right? That like the only problem here is like a lack of intellectual ability and like desire.
Yeah. And I think that's not true. And that's where it really falls down. You know, one of the problems, and is a bit more of a meta point, but with these kind of big bureaucratic institutions is very few people have an incentive to call other people out for their bullshit. It's a big feature of a lot of the COVID inquiry at the moment is people saying, well, culturally, we kind of don't really say that sort of thing to each other. We don't really point out the flaws. And I just think no one in Westminster and Whitehall has an incentive to try and point this out. So that's kind of what we wanted to do with the essay.
Given how deeply entwined this idea is with civil service culture, I wonder whether you've had much resistance to the idea of everythingism. Is there like a defensive reaction?
Well, it's a load of jobs as well, isn't it? Right? Because you've got to.
So
there's a whole load of people who need this stuff to justify their existence.
everythingism is an industry, absolutely, and it's an industry, and
But they want their slice of the everything bagel, to use the Ezra Klein.
absolutely. Look, I work for a think tank, right? Plenty of think tanks are as guilty of everythingism as anyone else, and it pays the salary, right? But there's an industry in it for sure, inside of government and out of, and that's part of the challenge. I think I'd say, there's been lots of pushback from the kinds of audiences you'd expect about that idea that this is a call for, lazy thinking, that this is a call for thinking the world is simpler than it is, which I think we're very clear on why that's not the case in the essay. But I would just say this is very hard to disprove, but a very large number of kind of current and former civil servants have sort of messaged me and over DM or in WhatsApp, including a lot of people I don't know, saying, I think this is absolutely spot on. I think there is an insurgent movement of anti-everythingists.
Any politicians in Labour?
So there are a couple of people. I've been, Chris Curtis of the Labour Growth Group has been talking a bit about everythingism recently at an event or two, and I think we're starting to build traction around this. That this idea that all of these causes, they're pretty good in their own way, but the mountain of policy making has just become too big and too complicated to kind of move through. And I hope that continues. I hope your listeners kind of join us in the anti-everythingist campaign.
Well, maybe in the interests of balance, we could talk about good examples of everythingism, projects that work. Would something like Concord fall into that category?
I think it depends on whether you think Concord works or not. I mean, Concord was
Concord.
Well, let's workshop that right now. So we use Concord as an example of where everythingism has plagued us, but plagued depends on your definition. That Concord was needed to be fast and technologically really, really innovative. It needed to be a joint Anglo-French project, and it was meant to be really, really affordable. And the sum total of those three proved that you could only do two, which are the first two, and it wasn't at all affordable, and it cost people a lot to run. Now, maybe the Anglo-futurist community thinks that the return of Concord is worth it, and I certainly hope that they can find a way to get the economies of scale going. But I think that's maybe that depends on your priors, right? I think a good example of where this is really true is maybe a bit further away from the policy we've talked about, and is in some areas of social policy. So things like the Troubled Families Initiative and various other different government plans over the years have tried to grapple with this kind of core issue that, like, if you look at public services, there's like a small percentage of people who have lots and lots of different issues: unemployment, health issues, homelessness, interactions with the justice system, social care. And, those are all different policy problems, but often they have at the core of them a relatively sort of small group of what David Cameron's government said with these troubled families, and you need to provide a kind of single support mechanism to help those people. I think that for a lot of social policy, everythingism is kind of is complicated, and actually I guess where I think it still holds is that although you're acknowledging the kind of complexity of people's lives and what's going on with them, the solutions are rarely everythingist solutions. Often the solution is, hang on, actually this person needs treatment for drug addiction, or this person just needs to be in jail, or this person needs to get a job, and that will sort out a lot of these things. Like, it's never perfect, but there's a bit of the 80-20 rule in that world.
That seems to me not a prescription for everythingism, but it's a problem of having a Justice Department, a Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Health as separate things. That it's actually it's an implementation and an operational problem. That actually it doesn't invalidate what you're saying if you took the number of these troubled families as a sort of metric and you said, right, the only thing we care about is bringing that number down, however you define it, and then you say that is our single goal, that would without a doubt be more successful, right? That is, I suppose, joined up thinking, but it is still with a very specific and limited goal. Like, everythingism is having a million goals and hoping to achieve them all, right?
Yeah, although to be fair to the essay, I think government will always have a very, very large number of goals. I guess my problem is the insistence on doing those goals through all the other goals, if you see what I mean. Kind of this kind of kludgy system where we expect, hang on, your policy is going to help my policy, is going to help Tom's policy. So, oh God, all these policies are going to be fine, right? And then you look around and none of them are fine. The version of this like kind of uses on growth, right? Like, I think if you lived through my lifetime, you've been told that we will have just about every kind of growth you could have. We're going to have green growth. We're going to have fair growth. We're going to have equitable growth. We're going to have innovation-led growth. We're going to have leveling up, which was sort of related to growth. And these things would all help with growth. And if you heard that and you lived on King Charles Space Station, you might kind of think at a distance, oh God, there's going to be so much growth, right? And then you look down and you think, oh no, there's no growth. And you think, well, hang on, maybe we just needed growth, and we want to figure all those other things out through their own policies.
Well, we're going to break for supper, and in the spirits of everythingism, we're going to pour a whole roast into a blender and enjoy one delicious slurry. We'll see you on the other side.
Men and women wanted for hazardous far solar journey. Low wages, high Gs, long hours of complete darkness. Honour and recognition in event of success. Safe return doubtful. Call at 7C Level 4 Artemis Station and ask for Michaels. Departure in 36 souls.
Welcome back, listeners. We broke to enjoy a dinner of slop, and now we are about to produce some more.
So, Joe, we in the first half, we talked about everythingism as an idea, and we talked about the examples of it across the government. I think now let's get actually to the important question of, why is this happening? Why do we have a government that seems to be acting in a way that is contrary to, I would say, pretty basic management principles that have a goal, have a clear objective, and target it? Like, where does this treacle or joined up thinking, or whatever you want to call it, where does that come from?
So I think it's a kind of tragedy of the commons. I think it's an example of where, like, day to day, most people's incentives are to participate in everythingism, even if as a whole we all suffer because we take part in it. So, like, I think very few people actually show up to work day to day to be everythingist. To be clear, there are some of those people, and you find them in, big bureaucratic institutions. But most people, like, don't try and make every issue happen everywhere all at the same time. What they have is, they have a single issue, and they are what I call in the essay a plus oneist. So, they don't want you to do everything everywhere all at once. They just want you to add their one thing in.
Just one more straw on
just
the camel's
one more
back.
Straw, just one more cup, and they each of these
This
things
can't hurt.
each of these goals seems like, usually it seems like plausible, it seems reasonable, it seems like a kind of, why not, right? Like, what are we really going to use? Maybe there's a trade-off. Maybe it's a small one. Maybe it's a big one. Probably we haven't counted. But the problem is you're not the only plus oneist. There are lots of them. And over time, the accumulation of this plus oneism is what gives us everythingism. So it's kind of built ground up until the whole thing becomes this kind of towering, wobbling mass that can't really be dealt with or managed or executed through.
Yeah, I think it's that term, that plus oneism, is a good one, right? Because, well, like at a party, most of your friends, if they just brought one more person, but inevitably, all your friends bring a group of losers, and the party all of a sudden has a rubbish vibe. It's not my best metaphor. Anyway, but okay, let's really cut to the heart of this, because we've talked a lot about kind of the statutory elements of this. So the Equalities Act, the Town and Country Planning Act, the Climate Change Act. And I don't think we've talked about that, but the Climate Change 2008 Act and its requirement that the government can take improving or reducing of our emissions at like every decision. Is this a behavioral question, or is it a statutory question? Like what's the way we can kind of cut this knot?
I think it's a bit of both, and we've talked a bit about the behavioural incentives. You're at a big meeting in Whitehall. People are coming with their plus oneisms. In the civil service, in politics, there's very little incentive to kind of say, no, hang on, I'm just doing this. I'm doing this my way. You can find a different way to do that, right? So there's a whole set of behavioural ones. What we've not really talked about is like the bureaucratic and structural ways we put this into place. And some of those are legal. So, the Equalities Act, Climate Change Act, the sort of privileging of certain goals in the policy-making process, which mean that no matter what you're doing, you have to show that you have, at the very least, kind of done a lot of due diligence and properly considered something. But actually, in practice, you've bent your policy kind of quite a bit out of shape to do it. I think those are things we got into, again, because plus one is just kind of went too far, right? They took something they were really passionate about and they thought, not only do I want this to win now, but I want it to win ever. We need a kind of whole system approach to this problem. The problem is we're taking whole system approaches to quite a lot of problems. If the government just sat down and said, climate change is the number one thing, it's always going to be the number one thing ever, we wouldn't be in kind of everything is territory. We'd have a really big one thingism. But instead, it's not the only process. And you can get to the point where you're trying to make policy in government, you find there are so many of these kind of checks and processes you have to go through that there are more people like trying to input into your idea than people who are actually trying to drive the thing through in the first place. It's a kind of culture of checkers and blockers is something the Prime Minister's talked about recently.
But it's not just behavioural, right? It's also institutional. And the Climate Change Act of 2008 seems to be a classic example.
Yeah, totally. And it's the way we've put some of these goals from being a really like important policy area in that time, in that way, into every single policy making process by exception, but generally speaking as the rule, that has privileged them over kind of other outcomes and actually has, started to eat away at the judgment of elected politicians often, which is, I think, where this, starts to become a slightly undemocratic thing. You create the quango that's to drive that policy, you create the act that's to institute that policy, and suddenly we find that the people we elect to decide what the policy is and do it start to have their hands kind of tied by the system. And, people who disagree with that might fairly say, well, hang on, Parliament's always sovereign. Parliament can kind of roll back things like the Climate Change Act. But I think what they miss, and whether it's the Climate Change Act or otherwise, is once you put these things in statute, you tend to create a constituency of people who's going to make it very, very hard for you to go back on it. And there's a kind of ratchet effect with putting this stuff into legislation to creating quangos. It's very hard to unpick. It only goes one way.
Well, I mean, and there's also, right, like an optics point in that what is a government that says the big thing that I want to do is roll back the Equalities Act going to look like, right? That because of the way it's been named and the way it's been described, it's very difficult, I think, in the public's mind to see the idea of the Equalities Act as like a blocker on equality, right? There's something very Orwellian about the naming of it, that because it actually is blocking the very aim that it's going for. And I think the the other point that I wanted to make is Theresa May brought in this idea that all governments should think about the climate, right? And it seems to me an example of the government admitting its own weakness, right? That because the government doesn't feel that it can like pull a lever and tell the civil service, I want crime to go down, for example, or I would like there to be fewer emissions. Instead, the idea is to sort of cast out this policy and hope that in the vast mass of processes, that will just like tip the balance a bit, because there's just so much legislation that's just like accreted on top of each other.
Yeah, totally. And where we're gonna, start to see this, I hope we don't get there, but is if the government decides the next thing it has to do is set some kind of awful growth duty on government, right? Where again, directionally, I would love more growth, but it's very hard for me to see how one more kind of extra statutory duty or one more quango or one more act on top of all these others, which drive in different directions, have different ways, is really going to help. And you can sort of see this when the Chancellor recently pulled in the heads of all of the regulators and said, I now want you to regulate for growth. Why don't you tell me what that looks like? And I think it comes from a slight impotence in government to be able to really grapple with how do you solve problems, and instead just think, I sit atop this big machine, I'm not sure how it works, but let me just sort of tell it what I want and it'll happen.
What's a really egregious example of the Climate Change Act affecting policy in some dunderheaded way?
I'm going to have to check my numbers on this, but a really good example of where I think we've got the trade-off balance the wrong way is it's recently emerged that the Crown Office government building in Glasgow is going to cost twice as much to refurbish to meet kind of emission standards as the building itself cost when they bought it. Now, that's a kind of, you might think that it's really, really important to cut emissions, but the money you're spending on that building, which is well into the millions to get that compliant, like, surely you could spend that better ways in other areas, even to deliver that objective, right? You might buy I forgot what they're called.
Carbon credits, or offsetting.
So you might buy offsets or carbon credits in other areas,
or just a rubber plant,
or just a rubber plant. You might
send some sulfur into the upper atmosphere.
You might invest in terraforming. You might do all sorts of things. You can't persuade me that like that one building having an egregious amount spent on it to get it to the standards which legislation requires it is the right way to do it. But because we take this kind of one size fits all approach through legislation, like that's how we've decided to do it.
But that's fundamentally like an accounting problem, right? In that because the government like can see the things that it is spending money on and not see the things that like the wider effect on business and the economy, that the government has kind of convinced itself that it is the primary actor in the country and like it's the most important thing. But when actually it should be thinking, how can I like let people act rather than how can I really stick my finger in to every single pie, right? It is a problem of accounting.
Definitely. It's another example of the when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail point, right? In that the kind of the Treasury, for example, where I used to work, is very institutionally biased to thinking about cost to government of something because it looks at those finances every day and it looks at them as budgets, and it doesn't think about cost to business, cost to society of regulation, which it does in this kind of one-off, very static way, often after we've made regulatory decisions.
Yeah. And when you touched a bit on the quangos and the sort of non-governmental organizations, these arm's length bodies that are created in order to try and drive these statutory requirements. These are a fairly new thing, right? These are a creation of a system that, and I feel quite strongly about this. I know other people don't, but I'll lay it out the way that I see it. Is the creation of these organizations was a creation of the kind of Blairite system that saw a lot of political process, the cut and thrust and disagreement as like fundamentally quite unpalatable. And so created these bodies where you could have experts who would, sit down very sensibly, nice, quietly, wouldn't be any shouting, and they'd just come up with the right idea. But this has created these constituencies you talk about, right? Who have these views and who are very difficult to challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an outgrowth of the sort of Thatcher era next steps agencies and different stages governments have always looked to kind of the idea that if we create something separate from us, we'll be able to outsource tricky decision makings to them. And I think the management theory behind that is quite complicated. But the thing they've missed throughout is that the public are never not going to hold politicians accountable for this. No one knows who runs the Climate Change Committee, but people know who Ed Miliband is. And so I think this government is starting to figure out that many of the things them and their predecessors have outsourced are uncomfortable things to outsource if you're not really outsourcing the accountability along with the responsibility for actually doing it.
Well, this brings to mind this fuss regarding the Sentencing Council, which, as listeners will probably recall, was due to impose, a literal two-tier system on sentencing, whereby if you were non-white, you were the judge was sort of teed up to give you a lighter sentence. And the government didn't like this, couldn't do much about it. They had to kind of surgically insert a bit of legislation to stop this kind of haywire body from creating this two-tier rule.
Yeah, and I think it was the interaction between those, the Ministry of Justice and the Sentencing Council was really surprising to people. The initial accusations were laid. The chair of the council kind of anteed up almost and said, absolutely not, we're not going to change our policy, we're independent. And it took the opposition and the government ramping up to do legislation and ultimately needing to legislate to prevent
Robert Jenrick
absolutely
projector
and I think
antics.
I think we're probably going to see more of this. Actually, I think the way I talk about this to people in tech, which will be some of your listeners, is that bureaucracies have emergent properties, a bit like language models. They have things about them that we didn't plan in that start to happen the more you let them run, and the more you poke them and prompt them and see what happens. And a lot of these bodies, as they get further away from the check and balance of democratic decision making, start to behave in ways which are really, really quite out of touch with what the public would want. And I think we've also all forgotten that in this country, Parliament's sovereign. We don't have a constitution like the US, say, which privileges the role of certain different bodies. Ultimately, this all comes back to Parliament. I think the public understand that. The public are ready to blame parliamentarians when things go wrong. And so they're always going to ultimately need to act on the issue of the day. And kind of these people, they're appointed to be independent, but they're independent. They're appointed by government, right? And they can be fired by government. They can be removed by government. And I think that they've got carried away with some of that.
Well, and I think there's a something of a view change or a shift in understanding of these organizations, right? Because it used to be that it was, and I think it was William Hague who had to apologize. I'm not sure about that. I'd have to check, but who had to apologize for directing a civil servant specific and telling them what to do. And where actually I think now there's increasingly the sense that actually the idea that ministers sit atop of these departments and can't direct process and can't go in and say, look, that's the decision you have to make. And I sort of, as the minister, I have the responsibility for this department. I'm not just a kind of distant guiding force.
Non-executive.
Exactly. And I think that point you make about Parliament will always be blamed, is right, because people don't know about the Climate Change Committee. Although I will say, the people who are attracted to go and work at the Climate Change Committee, these, as you say, these emergent properties, they attract people who are these single issue people, right? It's like you're creating basically a magnet for some of the more extreme and more like radical people who have these views, who will then see this organization as a way of pushing their single perspective, their plus one, into every decision making, right? Like, and because they're not accountable, they can get away with it.
Yeah, I think that some of the theory historically has been that, the day-to-day cut and thrust of politics is a bad environment for making good decisions about the management of organizations and policy. And look, I think that's all true. Like, I hate the Daily Mail test, and I wish that politics wasn't as driven by the kind of headlines of the day, right?
Is the Daily Mail test how it will play in the Daily Mail?
Yeah, it's a thing civil servants would talk about a lot,
Yeah.
and politicians would talk about
Yeah.
a lot. But I use it as an example. I think what we've got wrong...
People are talking about the Anglo-futurism podcast test now.
That would be something we'd get right. But what we've got wrong is that sort of deeply technocratic decision making, totally removed from any feedback mechanism, is better in most cases. That, I think, has been proven false. And politics is imperfect, but kind of bureaucracy increasingly seems to be a bigger failure mode.
I think one particularly irritating example of this is what I think we can probably agree is a misuse of the Equality Act, whereby recently there was a judgment. I think it was about warehouse labourers versus shop floor staff, something like that. And the judge ruled that it was unlawful for one to be paid more than the other. And so the judge defied the laws of economics to impose upon this organisation, and I suppose like any organisation, these requirements from the Equality Act. But these companies they're going to start going bankrupt if judges are telling them what they can pay people.
And indeed, it's had come at huge cost to local government and to city councils as well, which is something we're seeing playing out in Birmingham at the moment.
What do you want to maybe lay out what is going on in Birmingham? Because I think people have seen like these bin bags piling up, but they don't. I think it's actually quite unclear.
I think this is a multi-cause thing. I don't want to over attribute it to this one specific example, but Birmingham city council's going through really serious financial difficulties. And look, they aren't alone. It'd be fair to say most local government in this country is going through really challenging financial time for reasons which are like entirely structural.
Well, often because they've been given these statutory requirements, right?
Yeah,
like
particularly,
you put a statutory requirement on them,
crazy.
You think you've done a good thing, and it just like adds burden onto these.
Yeah, and I think part of the unaffordability seems to be driven by the same challenges you're talking about, Tom, where I think maybe it's a microcosm of a move of decision making away from both markets and democracy to a sort of technocratic process. I think what's most interesting about that legal case is that in their judgment, the judge recognized that the rates which were being paid were market rates. That this was broadly reflective of market dynamics. However, that was still not compliant with the Equalities Act. So it wasn't even a sense that there was some discriminatory move which went beyond normal market practices, and we can all imagine scenarios where companies behave really, really unethically. But it was that a market-based approach to running the economy was completely incompatible with the terms of this legislation. I think that is very, very dangerous.
I think I'll just lay out quickly for listeners what it was that happened. Was the binman employed by Birmingham City Council worked on a system called task and finish, whereby when they completed their work, when they finished their round, they could go home. And they were also awarded bonuses based on their performance. And these people working these jobs who received these bonuses tended, I think it was something like 72%. I don't quote me on that, but it was a large number, were men. And then people working in offices and in different sort of, the argument is less strenuous, more desirable jobs, raised this question, saw this as discrimination because most of the people in less arduous jobs were women. And so as a result, because Birmingham couldn't afford to raise the salaries of the people working in the offices, they've said that they won't award the bonuses to the binmen, so the binmen have gone on strike. And so they're at this impasse where Birmingham City Council, which is already in a severe financial position, has had to effectively throw its hands up and just let rubbish pile up on the street.
One of our listeners asks whether this is because we Brits have a uniquely moralised view of policymaking that resists trade-offs. She says, is the public to blame? They seem to want it all: safety, sustainability, inclusion and growth, no tax rises and free broadband.
I doubt I'm not an expert, but I doubt we have an internationally kind of outlier. It seems to me that everyone really wants it all, at least in quite democratic systems of government. Where I think this point becomes relevant is I don't think it's sustainable. And I think that we're going to have to quite quickly reckon with the fact that we can't have it all everywhere all at once in the way that we would like, because we've made bad decisions, start to have to make some quite hard choices. And where I think that's like most relevant and obvious is, the status quo persists. Things are just going to start failing more and more because we insist on checking all of these boxes, doing everything in this way. And people are going to be governments are going to be faced with the decision of, do they continue to let systems fail in really quite outsized ways, in Birmingham way, for example, or do they really change these processes? And I think, one of the other cultural things we talk about is the risk aversion of politics, where I don't think we're an international outlier particularly, but I think, the worse things get, I think the remaining risk that they could get even worse is lower, and the potential upside gets much higher. So I think the public are going to have to reckon with a much less moralized view of some of this policy making in the long run, but also policymakers are going to have to be able to take more risk, because I think the downside risk for them is less and the upside is much higher.
Yeah, although the problem is we have a system where two quite large groups have what feels like a bit of a stranglehold over the two parties. I mean, two parties, there are now three parties, but I'm talking here about the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, in that you have public sector workers acting as a big bloc who control or control the fate maybe of the Labour Party, and who would prefer no more kind of efficiency drives or performance-related pay and things like that. And the Conservative Party has the pensioners, who will resist any steps to lowering their pension, reducing the sort of already very generous benefits package. I know, although, of course, pensioners don't see pensions as benefits, although obviously most people are receiving more in pensions than they have paid into national insurance. What is the way through this? How can we get out of what feels like fundamentally an unresolvable situation where these two groups have a stranglehold, and it feels like, something like the example of the Rat King, which is the Rat King.
Please describe the Rat King. For
I hope you don't have those on the space station.
No.
We had to root them out.
Yeah, you should see Tom go down a hole with a knife and a gun. The Rat King is when lots of rats in a set, in a hole, sleep all together. Their tails get tangled up, and this big mass of rats are then unable to free themselves, and then they get stuck and they starve because they're unable to pursue food. I mean, maybe a better example is that of two stags whose antlers are locked together and will starve because they are unable to separate and are in this like death spiral together.
I think I can't fix the rats or the stags, but my instinct is what we'll start to see happen is, as these systems become too kind of kludgy and too hard to make sense of and drive through, people who are either able to drive radical change through the mess of British politics, or who are able to build alternative systems and processes outside of it, will be successful. They'll be radically quite successful. The system, be that a public or other, establishment politicians or markets, will acknowledge that and realize that, and they'll do something about it. They will support those people. My instinct is the systems break down a bit. Live players are going to start to engage with this and going to find a way to make change happen. And that could be for the good. That could be for the very bad. That depends on your politics and what you think is going to happen. But I think the everythingism is just one dynamic of how these systems have stopped working well.
Well, I mean, yeah, we are creating, as things get worse, we're creating an opening for radicalism, right? That as things get worse, and I think it's important to say, I think things could get a lot worse from where they are now, but we are opening the door to, and as you said, it depends on your politics, but we're opening the door to the end of steady as she goes, middle of the road kind of politics. And maybe the people who've always said, oh, it's not the British way to be radical, are going to be shown up because actually the conditions create the possibility for very, very hardline people to come in and say, look, I will sweep away this system. And, a lot of people I think won't like what that looks like. And frankly, it scares me. It scares me because I don't want that. But I don't think we are accelerating it by talking about it. I think we are just warning and being frightened of this train that is hurtling down the track towards us.
Well, let's talk about how we can fix everythingism. And what I'm about to bring up is not a solution to the whole piece, but one here's in Whitehall of fixers, people who can get policy through this tangled mess of requirements. Now, how important are these Sherpa individuals to negotiating the blob and making the necessary compromises with everythingism?
So they're both a feature of the system and probably something that the anti-everythingist coalition needs to reckon with in order to get out of it. The simple model, I think, is the more complicated politics becomes, the more everythingist it becomes, the more kludgy it becomes, the more you need Sherpas to help get you through that confusion.
Someone who can get you a laptop in 2 weeks or something.
And
steady on.
Hang on. Now, we should be fair. The last government laptop I was issued only took about 4 days. I think those numbers are improving, but it's still 4 days, far too many.
Sat there,
twiddling my thumbs. But the problem with those people is, you probably do need them to extricate you from the system, but in a sense they're also just part of the failure mode of the current system. And I think if you look at the kind of very top of the civil service, less so than it was, but still more so than is desirable, people's backgrounds are not just career civil service backgrounds, because there's 540,000 people in the civil service I worked in doing all kinds of things, but people who really their whole career has been being a kind of a vizier to ministers and being really good at that, exactly what you're talking about, that kind of Sherpering, getting the announcement through, getting the bill through, kind of getting the immediate thing they wanted, and maybe aren't quite so kitted out for running these kind of big, complicated organizations doing massive things. So it can be a bit of a deal with the devil.
So how do we go deeper? How do we go beyond the fixer, and what's the best way to cut through the bureaucratic accountability sinks?
So there are loads, but the accountability sink concept, which is Dan Davies's, and I borrow it for the paper, is moving much more back to a world of personal accountability, be that political or administrative or in commercial ways when it comes to the involvement of the private sector. Personal accountability for the success or failure of policies, that will really start to get the incentives going in the right direction. It's very hard. It involves overcoming some of that cultural stuff that we talked about earlier, about aversion to being difficult, challenging each other. But that's, the main way. And then I think the other way is just being willing to reject the meme of everythingism. We talk about this earlier. This sense that in some way it's behavioral, right? In some way that there are ideas which have become kind of memes that say, "Oh no, you should be an everythingist." And I think we need to arm people to say, "No, hang on. The main thing I'm trying to do here is tackle, X policy problem, and the 80-20 rule tells me that this big lever is going to fix it. And I've thought about the consequences a bit, but I'm not going to let myself get bogged down in endless meetings and slide decks trying to solve it. I'm going to tackle the problem head on." I think those would be the kind of two ways through.
And I think we've talked a lot about the civil service, and I know that some civil servants have listened to the podcast and say, you are just blaming us. I think we've even been called cringe. But it is a worthwhile point that Parliament is still sovereign, that these ministers do still have the ability to, if they wanted, say, sweep this aside and say, no, this cannot stand. And it's a Dominic Cummings sort of regular refrain that the problem is in many cases that the civil service has had to step up, where ministers have basically stepped back and said, I'm not really interested in running rural policy. I don't actually care about this. What I care about is getting my name in the Daily Mail in some way, so that then I get the better job and the great office of state is mine. Right? We are at a period now, and I think, we are at a period now where we have some of the youngest, also the most inexperienced ministers and prime ministers that we've ever had. These are people who have not been in Parliament long, have not been around the Rose Garden, do not know how these systems work, and are coming in and thinking, actually, gosh, isn't governing a bit of a bore? How do we find ourselves in a situation where fundamentally, again, both sides seem to have good intentions? This must be a politician's question.
Yeah, ultimately, it's all a question of politicians for the same reason we talked about earlier, that they're sovereign. They get to decide the rules. The civil service has a limited constitutional authority to really do anything, and most of that authority comes from convention rather than anything practically laid out in the statute book, with a couple of exceptions. I think it's absolutely the case that there are ministers who are fantastic and ministers who are really not very good at their jobs at all, and we've not built the kind of feedback loops and mechanisms and structures to hold them to account for that. And I just think a model where we're relying on, the classic refrain is like, could we send all the ministers to some sort of school for being ministers or something? And I think that if that's the answer, then you're asking sort of the wrong question, right? It's kind of, how do we reverse engineer the right kind of experience into a pool of people, rather than how do we go and find that kind of talent in the first place? And, there are things that all the major parties should be doing to try and acquire better talent in the future, but they've made the job a very, very unappealing one to a lot of people.
Which of them don't need to go to minister school? Are there any Joe Hill approved policymakers in office at the moment?
Look, I think it'd be unfair to
name.
Yeah. What I think I will say, because I think this is less well discussed, is where in the civil service do I think there's really interesting official led work, where are the real hubs of excellence and talent? Because for ministers of this government, other coming in, they want to know where can they go to get some of the kind of people, the best rights. And look, it's absolutely true that loads of really bright people still want to go and work in the civil service and do amazing work, and there are great opportunities for them. And I think there's some really exciting bits of government at the moment that ministers who are entrepreneurial should look at and think, hang on, how do I replicate that, right? What have they got going on there? The government 5 years ago had next to no really serious data science capability, AI capability. It now has not inconsiderable bits of that in Downing Street, in the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, where the incubator for AI now is, in the AI Safety Institute. Those are institutions we built in the last 5 years that are really high performing, high skilled, highly capable, and they're there for ministers to use if they need. And they should look at that and think, hang on, that stuff kind of happened, and some of us were part of it and some of us weren't, but actually we can use that, we can replicate that success. And if you wanted that success in lots of other bits of government, it would look a bit different, but the same principles would be there. Exceptional talent needs to be paid pretty well, not exceptionally by private sector standards, but better than we'd pay the civil service. It needs to be freed up from a lot of bureaucracy to do really good things, and you need to be willing to take some risks.
If you think of recent government success stories, they are AC, so the AI Security Institute that you mentioned, ARIA, the Vaccine Task Force, and the thing they have in common, and everyone's kind of smiling wryly here, is that they are not bound by the normal rules that government agencies are bound by.
Yeah. absolutely. I think that
Good job, we solved
one
it.
of the well, no, to give you a more than one word answer, like there's an interesting tension here, which is partly comes back to the thing we were talking about earlier, but quangos, right? Is like if you keep having to get high performance, take organizations out of the normal rules and processes and ways of running Whitehall, then at some point you need to think, hang on, what are we doing with all those rules in the first place? And it's maybe putting a band-aid on something which is a bit more of a problem, like a fundamental problem. We can keep kind of creating special units, taking things out. At some level, actually, that takes you on the path of creating quangos and things which cause us problems, like we were talking about earlier. But in the short term, maybe it's the right thing to do, but in the long term, what you're doing is leaving most of government to suffer with the same challenges it always has. And I think the government needs to get the metal and grip it and do the big thing. They can't just kind of pick on the kind of cool bits I was talking about earlier.
And as we were saying earlier, one key part of this broader problem seems to be a lack of appetite for recognizing and accepting trade-offs. How can we possibly create or how can we possibly edit our culture such that trade-offs are more acceptable? I mean, there's a line of William Blake that I enjoy, which is the cut worm forgives the plough. And I wish more people would reflect on those lines.
There are a few, and we should, in your Anglo-futurist future, maybe we should kind of give out knighthoods for practicing kind of good trade-off policy or some sort of new order of merit that doesn't currently exist. You could give some thought to that, maybe.
Our gong would be banging day and night.
So there's a set of cultural things where we should just reward this behavior, right? Like people who are really like ruthless and rigorous in pursuit of big government objectives, a bit like Kate Bingham was with the vaccine task force. We should say, hang on, that is what good looks like. We should keep talking about that. And we should study those things. I think there are some structural things we can do. Like the way that impact assessments for legislation, particularly for regulation, is done is mainly like after we've laid the regulation. So things like the second staircase rule.
Do you want to explain what that is?
Yeah, so the second staircase rule is a conservative government era bit of housing policy which requires buildings of a height above, I can't remember how many meters or stories.
I thought it was 8 floors.
8 floors, to have more than one staircase running through them. Now, most people don't have personal houses that are that high. These are mainly apartment buildings. And this rule was brought in as part of the follow-up for the Grenfell inquiry and kind of the move to take building safety of high-rise buildings more seriously. But the government's impact assessment of it found that which it did after it had kind of published and laid the regulations, found that the costs to society were kind of billions of pounds more than the benefits to society, including the benefits of the risk of avoiding the risk of people dying, really quite serious benefits. They found that still the cost to homeowners, to families, to people who want to buy or want to buy bigger and can't afford to as a result of this rule, massively outexceed any benefit. And actually, I think they said, you'd have to check me on this, that there was no evidence that it would actually improve people's safety. There was no clear evidence that it would improve safety. So when we're in a system where we kind of come up with the idea, we do the idea, and then afterwards we kind of check our maths on it and publish it, you're not going to win. You have to change the way around we do some of those processes.
Well, and there are 2 more examples of that, right? Which is Martin's Law, which I think was brought in after the bombing at the Ariana Grande, the Manchester Arena bombing, exactly, that puts exorbitant sort of safety and safeguarding requirements onto venues. So even if you are a small village hall, you need to have carried out your terrorism protection training. And the other one, of course, is the Online Safety Act, which makes websites responsible for the content that is put on them. And again, means that small online forums, and I think the classic example that people refer to is the hamster forum, which is a small website of hamster enthusiasts who go on and share sort of husbandry advice, now has to cease functioning. And that is not included in the sort of consideration of sort of benefits and cost the cost analysis.
Absolutely. Like, I think these processes where we kind of put the cart before the horse a bit, decide where we're going to get to, and then work out the rationalization afterwards are very damaging. And we should set higher benchmarks for effectively recognizing trade-offs in policymaking.
Is this what you hope your report will achieve?
Yes, I think that the single most helpful thing it might achieve is giving people the word, right? Is giving people the concept and is arming people who feel that this is a problem with something they can push back on to succinctly explain why. You know, if you try and come at this the way I originally did, by kind of, you go down management and economic theory, you get into the Tinberg rule and comparative advantage and all sorts of things people never heard of. It's very hard to concretely articulate why repurposing one policy for loads of other different policies is quite bad. But if we can kind of create this shorthand of explaining, no, that's everythingism, we don't want to do that, we should be radically focused on what we're trying to do here, I hope that will help people who know and feel this, like, push back on what they see as quite a kind of dangerous way of thinking.
Maybe we can press you a bit more on this. If this report could lead to 5 specific policy outcomes, or you're in like the policy sweet shop.
Yeah.
What are you going to grab off the shelves?
Well, and maybe we could add to that, like, what would policy look like that was non-everythingist? What would an effective policy look like that was non-everythingist? And then what would all the extra stuff that would be added in, what would be an example of that?
The Inequality Act, the Climate Stasis Act.
I'll take us back to the procurement example, which I think is a really good way into this, right? You know, if you, and I don't think this is necessarily the right answer, but I think this is directionally definitely the case, that if you're willing to say, which procurement policy clearly is, are all of our public procurements, we're willing to be, say, 10% less efficient in a traditional sense of how, price and quality, in exchange for driving these social values outcomes. What I would instead rather is if the government said, no, we're going to make procurements good value in core kind of economic terms, and then we're going to take the money we save or the quality improvement we get from that and spend that on driving our clean energy policy or our carbon offsets or whatever we need, through a policy which is so clearly directed at that, rather than trying to get at it through these kind of complicated back routes which we have in the Procurement Act. Or indeed, right, just let procurements be better at delivering those social value outcomes. And a lot of what government does is social value, right? A lot of the government procurements we're talking about here will be for clean energy technology or for government, upskilling and regional development. And it's bizarre to kind of sit down with those things which clearly have a social value purpose and say, but hang on, where's the 10% for you guys? Like, what else are you doing? So that would be a good example of non-everythingist policymaking, is saying, look, these goals are valid, but if we separate them out a bit and we are really clear on what we're targeting, then actually we'll get the best of both worlds, because we'll be much more efficient in each program we tackle. So that's, there's a set of those I'd want to see around procurement policy. On regulatory policy, the government already kind of going in this direction, but there's this long list of, I think we named them in the paper, it's 20-something statutory consultees with different kind of roles on development projects. I'd want to see, so these are, Natural England, the Theatres Trust, like people like that, like who get our Sports England, get a look in on different kinds of development, depending on where it is and what it is. You'd want to see that list really, really come down. Very few people having these kind of veto points or these check-ins. There's this sort of insane thing that's kind of come to my attention recently that I wish we'd put in the essay, about how police forces get a look in and a say, and often kind of write in to complain to councils about planning applications for like developments in areas, because they're worried that it will be harder to police a new public space or more residential housing, which really strikes me as like a race to the bottom of our kind of public spaces. If the police can say, no, we think the public might enjoy that a bit too much and we'll find it hard to police. Like, I would really rather we focused on doing that well and then doing policing and justice really, really well. Those would be a few.
Well, it's the tail wagging the dog, right? It's the police defining what behavior is allowed so that they can police it, rather than it being the people behaving the way they want and the police are there as like sort of the backstop.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's even the behavior that's allowed, because the law is pretty clear on that, but it's the it's the conditions, it's a park that might attract people who want to have fun, but it also might attract some pretty bad people who want to have bad fun. So we'll, let's stop them and, make everyone else pay the price.
Right. So imagine that you achieve everything that you've just outlined. We've totally rooted out everythingism. How good can things get? What does that Britain look like?
That Britain looks great. and the thing we say in the paper, which I think is true, is like, rejecting everythingism is the first step to getting everything we want. And I like that has a sort of nice sound to it, but I do mean it. And what I mean by it is like the paper isn't a rejection of abundant futures or us being able to have lots of different things. I think in the short term, we're very resource constrained. We have some really difficult trade-offs to make. But as many of your guests and listeners will have talked about, particularly if we can get economic growth growing in the right direction, we can just afford a lot more nice things across all kinds of different policy outcomes. If we can get energy costs down, if we can get housing costs down, people can literally afford more things. So if we can get things going in the right direction by getting some of the key big things to work well and to not be held back by everythingism and kind of constrained by that, then I really do think in the future we can just have much more of all of these goals. But the thing we need to get out of is just insisting we can't do anything unless it does everything in the way we want, everywhere, every time. Right, like we need to allow a little bit more flexibility, and it is like much more abundant, clean energy too cheap to meter. It is housing which is affordable to people. It is like a world-leading R&D program, a defense industrial base that can protect us, safe streets. You name it, we can have it.
Yeah, that sounds like the kind of Anglo-futurism that we want to see on this show. Joe, we've pretty much processed you through our podcasting slot machine, but we have a few questions from friends of the show, which Calum is going to kick off with.
And the first one comes from James, and the question reads that the government is focused on growth and claims that it wants growth, but in a tight fiscal environment, the Treasury has reverted to type, and we're enforcing austerity to keep yields down, particularly to the chagrin of some, like Lord Blunkett, who've called for flex in the financial rules to invest, to grow. It's not the first time that calls for the government to remodel itself to focus on growth and investment have fallen flat in the face of financial realities, and particularly HMT's like vast power. So, what's your take on kind of the Treasury as this central budget setting, both a growth and a tax and spend defining department? How do we deal with this fact that there squats this toad of the Treasury over the entire government that kind of holds the purse strings and says, computer says no?
Yeah, the Treasury does need to change. I have a sort of slight aversion to pushing on this point too hard, because I feel a strong personal nostalgia for my time at the Treasury and my former colleagues there. And I have written a lot about, I think people outside of government underestimate how much the Treasury really is the only institution that cares about your money not being spent on crap ideas. And there are a lot of really crap ideas. So, with that caveat, the thing we were talking about earlier was how, the Treasury is really focused on managing the day-to-day, cost to the taxpayer of things at the expense of really having a good understanding of what drives growth in the economy and what would be some genuinely good kind of investments to make for the country, which maybe have to be bootstrapped by the private sector. I think it has a mismatched perception of those. And then I think in its own house, it has this the kind of a saying is, the price of everything and value of nothing attitude. I think that the Treasury is in a sense, quite good at short-term cost control, but actually terrible at long-term cost control. No one can look at the state of the public finances and think the Treasury is doing the main thing that we think it's really trying to do. And that's because I think it's lost sight of these things where it was haggling a little bit on price too much and not really thinking about the upside. A classic example of this is the civil service workforce. There are people with all kinds of different skills who you could get to come and work in government who might cost twice what a civil servant doing that job is, but whose value would be 10x, 20x, 100x, like huge multipliers. The Treasury's rules just basically don't buy that. The Treasury's rules on employment basically don't buy that that's how public servants work. And, that's clearly not true. Outlier talent's so important, but we don't have any way of valuing that.
And how about we sling you a hospital pass now, Joe? This is from a female listener. Unbelievably, we have some, who says the trade-off denial that personally drives me absolutely insane is the trade-off between mass third world migration and women's gay whatever rights. What do you make of that? I suppose she's thinking of Oldham and Rotherham and all this kind of horrific stuff that seems to be related to certain patterns in immigration.
Yeah, I think...
at what point does it get so bad that a government would have to change its policy? There seems to be kind of... I suppose what she means is that there's a lack of trade-off consideration there.
Yeah, I think at the time we're recording this, Trevor Phillips, who's formerly chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission's made this kind of big intervention on the subject of grooming gangs, for example, and has really made the point that he thinks that the government's discomfort with pursuing a kind of national inquiry, or I think it's just come out this week, or actually really even allowing local inquiries to really be well funded and go ahead, it is due to concerns about the demographics involved and the extent to which this is to do with kind of recent waves of immigration. And I think it's probably true that our kind of multicultural policies have basically stayed the same as Britain's changed radically quite quickly in demographic terms, and we need to find a way to reckon with that. I think that the problems, the risk with a kind of high migration world is that we import lots of the rest of the world's problems rather than that we import kind of the best and the brightest and what we want. I think we've kind of got a really mixed picture of that, and the government finds it quite difficult to kind of reckon with some of those realities.
Yeah, and you're right? It's a fairly obvious thing, I think, to most people that you can have people who are immigrants that are productive and immigrants that are non-productive, and immigrants that are socially beneficial and immigrants that are non-socially beneficial, right? That creates four categories, and obviously there's one category that you very much want, and there's three categories that are probably not so good. I think the next question that I wanted to ask you was linked to an idea that another friend of the show, Harriet Green, refers to, which is that of abundant feudalism, which is the idea that there exists now a large amount of the country who are totally dependent on the state. And so that means they send their children to public sort of state-funded schools. They often work in publicly funded jobs. They use public services, both transport and health. Their lives are totally wrapped up with the state. And now we see situations where the government's saying, well, children should have free school meals, and children, should have teeth brushing lessons. There's a point here where part of this everythingism is just this expansion of how many things the government should do. Fundamentally, that question of, you can be very siloed, you can have these specific goals, but the number of things the government has to do is growing. So it's sort of like you almost get back round to everythingism just as a
It creates it. You're saying it kind of creates it by the scale of what you're talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'd never heard Harriet make the point before you mentioned it earlier, but I think it's I like the turn of phrase. I think there are maybe two things going on there. The first is, the first is just the kind of growing presence in our lives of the state, and for the demographic you described, that's absolutely, like that's undeniably true, and it will continue to grow, particularly as public sector employment grows as a percentage of kind of the economy, or public sector employment plus heavily regulated private sector employments, and more of the private sector is becoming regulated as well. So in that sense, also we're drawing more jobs kind of into the ambit of government, right? I think that there's a slight caveat to that on the public sector workforce, which is like, I'm kind of relatively comfortable with, like, I was a public servant for a long time. I'm kind of comfortable with the state, employing people to do things which are really important. I don't actually think that a lot of the rise of public sector employment is to do with kind of almost like a growth of the welfare state, which I think is a separate point you're kind of maybe getting at, which is, the teeth brushing lesson's a really good example. Like, how is the role of the state in society and in looking after people changing? Where I think we've just unsustainably grown it, and we've lost any real sense of personal responsibility, community responsibility, family responsibility, and it's we were talking a bit in the break, but I think it's worth saying again, like, it's difficult to see how you get the ratchet effect going back in the opposite direction, right? Because it's become so easy to kind of abdicate responsibility for those things. The state ends up picking up the slack, particularly in services like schools, which are kind of very universal experiences. But we need to, if nothing else, because the numbers don't make sense. I mean, the OBR forecast that by 2070, debt to GDP will be 270%. It's 100% today. I remember a few years ago, people saying, "Oh, we'll never get to 100%." We got to 100%. That was meant to be a kind of real inflection point in the private markets. And, maybe we have started to see a bit of that market movement in the last few years. But the idea that 200%, 270% is unimaginable, like that's it's entirely imaginable. We could absolutely end up there. It'd be a really dangerous world. But the growth and the cost of the public finance is absolutely to do with the growth and the cost of just society and running so much of it through the state.
And we'll wrap up shortly, Joe. But I note your hypocrisy in talking about everythingism and the importance of focusing on a single goal, whereas you have been moonlighting running a thing called the Greater London Project. Could you tell us a bit about it?
I never expected to be quite phrased like that, but maybe I should be more reflective. The Greater London Project is a sort of community group with a Substack and it's kind of big event series in London, which is really trying to bring together people who care about like an abundant future for London. Like, what is the future of London? I think one of the things that strikes me most as someone who's lived in London for most of my life is that despite the kind of hugely outsized role this city plays in like our country's economy and our life and our politics and our culture, like talking about its future is quite an uncomfortable thing. I think it's downstream of a few different things, including the sense that we need to level up other parts of the country and we need to get economic growth going outside of London. I don't ignore that, but kind of as a Londoner and as someone who sees my, family and my life and my future in this city, it's kind of weird to me how absent a vision of the future of London is from our kind of discourse and for Londoners. I think it's maybe downstream of a sort of really bad part of how the life of being a Londoner has become, which is that for most people kind of our ages, London has become this sort of temporary thing. right? Like whether you were born here or you moved here or you've only been here for a bit, most of my friends have this sort of sense that London is not forever for them because it's so unaffordable, particularly for family-sized accommodation. Public transport is becoming more and more affordable. They're more and more aware of crime, particularly kind of violent crime and shoplifting and phone snatching in central London. And they just don't see a future for them there. And actually, you know, a lot of them are going through this kind of extended leaving, moving further and further out of London as prices become too high. And I think that if you had to sum it up in one sentence, the Greater London Project is us trying to say, you know, what would a London be like where you didn't have to leave?
And what can you actually do about these problems?
Well, you can reject everythingism for one of them. And I think you know, there are plenty of really good examples in London where insistence on everythingism has really held us back. I think personally, like a really good example of this is a lot of how we think about housing development and the insistence on often very large developments having a very high kind of affordable housing ratio. Now, look, this is London. None of the housing is affordable by anyone's measure of it. But if you look at how many planning applications are rejected because of affordability ratios, you know, many like overall housing would be much more affordable if any number of those had been built, just because even if you build a slightly more expensive end, ultimately it depresses prices. So, you know, rejecting everythingism is a key part of London's future. You know, I can make those two concepts fit very, very nicely. But there are lots of others. I mean, London is not monolithic, right? There are 32 boroughs and a city and a mayor and a national government, which has a pretty big role. There's also, you know, more kind of community groups and organizations trying to do this sort of thing than I can count. And I think one of maybe the most pernicious reasons why people don't kind of organize to change London is, I don't know about you guys, but like my experience in my 20s in London was constantly moving around it, right? Like constantly moving around it. So you didn't have that sense that you were 12 months in somewhere, then your landlord's going to raise your prices and you're going to move somewhere else. And so you never really bed down some of those local roots that become part and parcel of like building a community, looking after each other, campaigning on issues and trying to fight for like local development or local opportunities. And I just, there's something in how transient London has become for a lot of people that has like got us below a mark where we're all kind of a bit docile. And I think we should be much more activist.
Well, I mean, in a sort of slightly odd situation, the only people who can sort of expect to be living for a long time in a single area are people in social housing, like council-provided social housing, right? That there is a statutory requirement that people should be allowed to continue living in their area for people in social housing, but not for private housing.
Yeah, it's a really good example.
With that, Joe, we will thank you for being here and for setting all problems that the state has to rights. Listeners, you've heard the word of the man. Go forth and do less.
Thanks for listening. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you very much for having me, guys. Go forth and do less is actually like such a good one.
This has been an episode of the Anglo-Futurism podcast. For more episodes, make sure you subscribe at anglofuturism.substack.com. That's anglofuturism.substack.com.